Good evening. It's my tremendous pleasure and privilege to introduce my friend, Merlin Sheldrake. I expect that everyone here is here because you know about this extraordinary book, Entangled Life. Merlin's a biologist with a background in plant sciences and lots of other things as well. He did his PhD in tropical ecology at Cambridge, working on underground fungal networks in tropical forests in Panama. He was a pre-doctoral research fellow at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, and he has done so much in his life already. This, astonishingly, for a work as accomplished as it is his first book. And it's accumulated a really embarrassing number of plaudits. It was the Radio 4 Book of the Week. It was a Goodreads Choice Awards finalist. And if you look at the various reviews, reviewers have vied with themselves to pile up the superlatives. Dazzling, vibrant, it will change the way you see the world. I'm surrounded by a web of wonder. This is a magical journey. His charm is devastating. It's an astonishing book. It's ambitious and will smash up every paradigm that we live our lives by. And it's all true. This is a book which is about the way that the natural world is interconnected, about the absurdity of trying to see ourselves or anything within the world as a discrete atomized unit. And so I'm tremendously excited to be inviting Merlin to tell us something about his conclusions about fungi and about what his conclusions about fungi might mean for the way that we live our lives and the way that we do our agriculture. So, Merlin, welcome.
Thank you, Charles. That's a very embarrassing introduction, but very sweet of you.
I'm hoping to embarrass you a lot more over the course of the next hour. The plan is to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll throw things open for questions. If you could email any questions in the boxes on the side of your screen, there's then going to be a facility to vote for the questions which the assembled multitudes think are the ones that they themselves would want answered most, and I'll put those to Merlin. So, Merlin, fungi. What would a world without fungi look like?
It's one of those impossible counterfactual questions. I think it would be unrecognizable, that's for sure. Certainly the life systems, the biospheres, the terrestrial environments that we stroll around in. Without fungi, plants, algal ancestors of plants wouldn't have made it onto the land. And without plants on land, then of course everything would look very different to the way it did today. So so I think we wouldn't recognize it.
I'm sorry, Charles, you were just muted for a second. If you could just re-ask that question.
Hello, Merlin. What is a fungus?
So fungi are a kingdom of life. So it's as broad a category as animals or plants. And unlike, say, bacteria, which are called prokaryotes because they don't have a complex system of internal compartments within their cells, fungi are eukaryotes, which means, like animals and plants, they have a nucleus, they have other organelles within their cells. Unlike plants, they don't photosynthesize, so they don't make their own energy from sunlight and carbon dioxide. So they're more like animals in that sense, and they have to find food in the world, ready-made, and then digest it. But unlike animals, they don't move around, so they grow places, they don't go places, so they're somewhat more akin to plants in that sense. But unlike both animals and plants, they all make their cell walls from a compound called chitin, which is one of the defining characteristics of the fungal kingdom.
And they have been relational creatures from the start of their history, haven't they?
Yeah, and I think it's something to do with their lifestyle. Most fungi live most of their lives as mycelium, which is the name given to a growth form of branching, fusing networks of filamentous cells. And because mycelium is all about digestion, it's all about feeding. It's about putting their bodies inside the food. Unlike animals, they put their bodies in the food. They don't put the food in their bodies. And because they're strung in such intimate contact with their surroundings, they have to be in order to feed. It means they're also in intimate contact with other organisms. And so there's something about this astonishing contact, I think, that has led them into a variety of world-changing relationships over the course of their long history.
So about 500 million years ago, I think, the ancestors of plants were floating out at sea. It was an algal soup. The algae came into the land, and the fungi were effectively their roots. Is that right?
That's right, but freshwater rather than the sea. So the ancestors of land plants were thought to be freshwater algae. So we're thinking of the soggy shores of lakes and rivers, and when these algae wash up, they're used to floating in the nutrient broth of these water systems. They're not used to having to forage in these solid soils, or the solid medium, which these early soils confronted them with, and so fungi were able to forage in these complex environments and could find nutrients and water to give back to their algal partners. The algal partners, of course, could eat light in the process of photosynthesis, and so they could provide the fungus with energy-containing carbon compounds. And so this relationship was such a hit. And that it's continued to this day, and it's what we call mycorrhizal relationships. But as you say, back in the day, for the first 50 million years or so of algal life on land, mycorrhizal fungi were the root systems of these early plants. Plant root systems didn't evolve for 50 million years after they made it onto the land. So I think of the roots as following fungi into being.
Yep. So plants got roots, but they didn't lose their fungi when they got roots.
Absolutely not. The roots became sort of stables for their fungal allies.
So what do fungi do for plants now?
Well, lots of things. So mycorrhizal fungi live in plant roots and extend outwards into the soil, and they forage nutrients like phosphorus or nitrogen or other micronutrients and water. And so there's primarily a nutritional situation, and they exchange those with the plants in return for these energy-containing carbon compounds. But they do more than just feed plants. They also protect plants from disease. They help plants resist drought. They do all sorts of things. And this is just the root fungi. Then all plants have endophytic fungi which live in their shoots and in their leaves. And these fungi are a sort of a prosthetic immune system for plants, and they help defend plants against invading pathogens. And they also help nourish plants in different ways and also protect plants from drought. So above and below ground, plants are bristling with fungi, the roles of many of which we're just beginning to understand.
So fungi obviously hugely important, not just for plants, but for the rest of the biological world and for us, because we're all dependent upon plants. But it's only since the 1960s that they have occupied their own kingdom. And mycology has been a bit of a Cinderella specialty, hasn't it? Why?
Yeah, it's an amazing thing. Bacteria too, only in the 60s did they win their taxonomic independence. It always surprises me. So I think there are a few reasons. One is a problem of access. So most fungi live most of their lives out of our reach in the form of mycelial networks, which are deeply insinuated with whatever they're living within. So it's hard for us to see them, to study them, to know them. Mushrooms, of course, are easily studyable, but they're ephemeral and they don't preserve well. And so I think one is a problem of access. And then as technology advanced and allowed us to do things like DNA sequencing, which of course was one of the reasons why we could partition life into these kingdoms that we know today. But we can also take a pinch of soil and sequence the DNA and work out who's living there in a way that would simply be impossible if we were trying to use a microscope, for example. So I think one is access. We simply didn't have enough reach. But then I think there's a few things that have changed that have also fed into this this resurgence of interest in fungi. Once we have a separate kingdom that fungi can exist in, then it stops just being the province of plant scientists. So before this distinction was made, then fungi were considered to be plants. And so within botany departments competing for the same botany grants and the same professorships, the people studying fungi would have a whole kingdom would be represented in a few people studying fungi in a dusty corner of a botany department. So I think that this entrenched a disciplinary bias against fungi because they didn't have an equal claim to the resources that power science and power the other process of inquiry. So a few reasons. Of course, there are other things too. I mean, people have had strange relationships with fungi for a long time in many countries. They're hard for us to know because they don't seem to fit in to the normal ways, the normal rules of being a living organism. Linnaeus described fungi as a scandal of art, a chaos, when he was worrying through his taxonomic system. And it was hard for him to make sense of these organisms. They didn't seem to behave in the way that they should. And so I think there are some deeper reasons at play, which is maybe one of the reasons they also feature in mythologies and folk tales in often strange and unsettling ways.
A lot of your book deals with mycorrhizal fungi, these vast networks. But I suppose the precursor of understanding of mycorrhizal fungi were the lichens, where I suppose one might say symbiosis was really invented or grappled with. Is that right?
Yeah. So it was in 1869 that Simon Schwendener proposed his dual hypothesis of lichens. And the dual hypothesis of lichens was a hypothesis that lichens weren't a single organism, as had long been assumed, but that they were made up of a fungal partner and an algal partner. And in Schwendener's view, that the fungus provided the substructure and the nutrient capturing ability, and then the algal partner was sort of kept as if in a greenhouse, photosynthesizing and providing the energy-containing carbon compounds to keep the relationship powered. And it was met with lots of scorn and disbelief, and all as new ideas often are. But one of the people who was studying lichens was a symbiotic visionary called Albert Frank. And Frank, in his study of lichens, he realized that a new word was required, because until this point, the intimate sharing of bodily space had meant one of two things: parasitism or disease. And Frank thought that a new word was needed, one that didn't presume to know what the dynamic of the relationship was. And so he coined the word symbiosis. He brought the word symbiosis into biology to do this. So lichens were this gateway organism to this concept of intimate sharing of bodily space, intimate cooperation in nature. And in fact, it was Frank in 1885 who coined the word mycorrhiza as well. And he was not the first to describe mycorrhizal fungi, but he was the first to suggest that they might be involved in a mutually beneficial relationship. They'd assumed to be parasites before. So a lot of this was the work of Frank, and yeah, exactly. It was a story that started with lichens and then broadened into a biological principle.
So, a mycorrhizal network, how big can they be?
So it depends on how we want to define the network. If you think about a network as just the mycelial network formed by one fungal genotype, then it could range for tens of meters, potentially more. This work hasn't been. These networks haven't been. The individuals and the genotypes haven't been measured enough as much as they should, and so there are studies that have mapped them over tens of meters, but they haven't gone further than that. So they might extend further. But of course, a mycorrhizal network isn't just one fungal network. That's the whole point of the mycorrhizal network, is that it's a fungal network enmeshed with the roots of the plant, and the roots of those plants might be enmeshed with other fungal networks, and other fungal networks, they overlap. And so plant and and fungal parts of these networks overlap, and so they kind of spill outwards, these open shared networks, which could extend for a much, much larger area. So it depends where you want to draw the line. Of course, drawing a line around these networks is very hard, which is one of the fun things about them.
Yeah. So it's impossible, as I understand it, to talk about fungal networks in isolation. So they're wrapped around other things, they're embedded in the cells of other things. So in order to describe a fungal network, you necessarily have to describe the whole network of relationships. You have to describe the whole context in which the thing exists. Now, if that's right, does that cause you to question your whole idea of an individual organism in other contexts, quite far apart from the world of fungi?
Yes.
Are we all ecosystem? Am I an ecosystem because of my athlete's foot?
I'd say that you're an ecosystem partly because of your athlete's foot, yes, and partly because of the trillions of bacteria and fungi that live in and on you, and without which you wouldn't grow and behave as you do. And so all organisms share their bodies with microbes. And of course, microbes share their bodies with smaller microbes. There are bacteria that have smaller bacteria that live inside them. Fungi have bacteria that live inside them, that play very important roles in shaping their metabolic abilities and the various ways they relate to their surroundings. Large viruses can have small viruses living inside them. This is really just how life is. It goes all the way down. And so, yes, I think I find that fungi dislodge questions, which I then realize have more general relevance. And of course, fungi aren't the only organisms to live their life embedded in their surroundings. So do we. You know, we grow up as individuals, totally shaped by what we're exposed to, and in return, shaping what is exposed to us. And so there's this kind of reciprocal influence, reciprocal dependence that all organisms, including us, lumbering, centralized animals, as we are. And so, but fungi make this just very, very clear, you know, and this is, I think, why they're such interesting organisms to think about, because they remind us, because they form these actual living networks, they remind us that that all life is engaged in these networks of relationship, even if we don't form persistent physical connections with other organisms. If you think about you and all your friends and draw them with lines between them, this forms a network, right? But you don't actually have links between you, but fungi do, which makes it impossible for us to forget that this is going on. So I find them very useful in this way.
So the interconnectedness of things is not just a metaphor when it comes to the fungal world, which reminds us that it might be at least an extremely potent and possibly a ruling metaphor when it comes to human and other relationships, I guess. Mm-hmm. When a fungal network creeps out, the distant tips might come across a food source or an obstruction. And it seems as if the network itself will be making a decision about what to do in that situation. But yet there is no central controller. How do you picture to yourself the decision-making process at the very edge of one of these networks?
Well, it's a riddle, and it's fun to spend time in this uncertain space that riddles create. I think it's good for our minds. Certainly it loosens the grip of our certainties, and it's corrosive to dogma. It's a good kind of cold shower treatment if I'm ever feeling too certain about something. But yeah, it's a real puzzle, because fungal networks live their life bathed in a flood of sensory information. They're sensitive to temperature and all sorts of different chemicals, and to acidity, and to pressure and light and gravity. And so a fungal network might sprawl, let's say, over a meter, and then different parts of the network are exposed to different environmental conditions, which create these data streams, flooding through the body of the fungus. But unlike animals, where we have nice, neat brains, which we can think of as a place where we can integrate perception with action, fungi don't, as you say, have a central controller. So what's going on, and how is it possible for a fungal growing tip in this part of the network to either branch, to grow fast, to grow slow, to grow up, to grow down, to assess how to grow based on what's happening in the other parts of the network, without any place for those data streams to come together. And so we really just don't know the answer to this. It seems that they're able to do this, to integrate this information both everywhere at once and nowhere in particular. You can think maybe about each of these growing tips, and it's the growing tips that the growth happens, that these decisions are made, if you like. And so at each growing tip, you can think about this as a place of integration. And so you have information being integrated at massively parallel basis at all of these growing tips. And so as this growing tip is making a decision or exposing itself to a new change in its environment, that data will then flood through the network and influence the decisions of the other tips. But it's very hard for us to get our minds around this.
So if a wood-rotting fungus encounters a new source of food, will the network pour its resources into the exploitation of that new source and abandon old, less fruitful sources?
Yes, this has been demonstrated with very elegant experiments by Lynn Boddy at Cardiff University. And so one of her great studies shows a block of wood. So a wood-rotting fungus is embedded in a block of wood and placed onto a dish. And the fungus, when it's eaten enough of the block of wood, it starts to explore. And it ranges out from the block of wood, forming a kind of fuzzy white circle, exploring in all directions at once. Something that we wouldn't be able to do if we were dropped off in a desert and had to pick one direction to try our luck finding water. And so this fungal network grows outwards in all directions at once, but then at one point, there's another block of wood in the dish, and then fungal network discovers the other block of wood. And at that point, it thickens the connection with this new block of wood, and it withdraws from these fruitless areas of exploration. And it completely remodels itself. And so then it would pour its resources, pour its growth into this new block. And you'd see a kind of highway forming between these two blocks. And that would happen again and again, potentially.
Brains are a dangerous way to concentrate your neurological processing power, aren't they? You can bite your head off or have it crushed by a lorry, and that's you. If you decentralize, you're much less vulnerable to environmental change or predation. Why isn't decentralization a solution to all those dangers, which natural selection has forced on all of us?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that the centralization is good for speed. And so living on the timescales that we do, having a centralized processing zone is quite useful. Also because we're about movement, right? If you're moving around, it's like we've got everything packed in a convenient suitcase of our skull. We wouldn't want to have everything trailing along behind us. It would be much harder for us to locomote if we were a little bit everywhere and nowhere in particular. And so you can see fungi and plants, which both have very decentralized ways of living, but also they don't tend to move that much in their vegetative state. They move, of course, in the form of seeds or spores, but that's a different phase of their life. So I think it's to do with movement, to do with speed, and centralization really can help us in those terms. I mean, if you just think about the speed of propagation of electrical signals through animal bodies, it's pretty fast through our neurons compared to the speed of propagation of electrical signals in plant bodies and in fungal bodies.
So, Merlin, what have your reflections on the fungal world done to your politics and your sociology? So we have very centralized ways of looking at society. We talk about central government and the head of state or whatever. And we tend to talk about ourselves as discrete individuals. But both you and I, in the course of the last 20 minutes, have used personal pronouns thousands of times. Should we be decentralizing our societies in the light of what fungi can tell us? Should we be stopping our use of the word I in response to what we learn from the fungal world?
Yeah, this is a good one. And I mean, I think about this question of individual a lot. Our societies are predicated on being able to define a neatly bounded individual who can be responsible for the things that individuals are responsible for. And capitalism is based on the rational behavior of individuals with free choices. All of these various ways that individuals are essential for the structures that we make, often very centralized structures. And so I've been thinking a lot about the way that ourselves, which we just, this question of an individual, which in biological terms, it's very clear when you look at different levels and scales in the biological world that this is a term that's useful and convenient, but it's about our convenience. It doesn't really have a great deal of biological basis, because you can always find a level within an organism in which there are other organisms living. And so when you start to think about this idea of the individual as something which is about our convenience and about the ways that we want to order and structure our lives and societies, then you think about, well, what is it convenient for? And I think one of the things it's convenient for is helping to justify exploitation of both other humans, in the sense that we can imagine our lives as neatly separable from other humans, and also the living world that sustains us, because we can justify the destruction of an ecosystem if we can pretend that that's not going to hurt us because we're separate from it. So I think there's something about this neat parceling of individuals which we use to excuse our behavior, to justify our behavior. And I think that has all sorts of political consequences. I mean, the way you think about individuality determines the way we distribute responsibilities and resources, for example. So I'm wondering about this, these elastic boundaries of the self. Can we grow the concept of ourselves? Can we realize that our self is an idea that we use for our convenience? And so are there situations in which we can grow this idea of ourselves, to think of ourselves as not neatly definable, clean, boundaried, but with soft edges that fray outwards and interpenetrated by other selves, other organisms? I think this could lead us into some potentially healthier places.
Yeah, so some psychoactive fungi and other plants appear to increase the sense of connection with the beyond, to increase a sense of oneness with the rest of the universe, to decrease the sense that you are an atomized self, increase the porosity of your boundaries. If fungi are doing that to us, does that suggest that we are supposed to be in an ecological relationship with fungi at that psychoactive level? Do we need fungi as ecological tutors and therefore moral tutors?
Well, I think that there are lots of benefits that these experiences can bring. I think there are lots of ways in which we need our boundaries softened, in which we need to be decentered from ourselves and from our egos. And so I think psychedelics can really help with these things. Of course, it's not a universal solution. It depends very much how they're taken, in what context, all this kind of stuff. But in general, I think there are some very powerful lessons to be learned from these experiences. And of course, humans have been using these psychedelic substances for an unknowably long time in various different contexts around the world. But there are a few cultures who have not used some kind of mind-altering plant or fungus for the purposes of healing or acquiring knowledge or making connections with the world at large. So So yes, I think there's something about these experiences which can keep us healthy, and I think there's something about our predicament now, which is in sort of particular need of being kept healthy, made healthy.
So psilocybin is increasingly used as a treatment for depression. So a relationship with mushrooms in that clinical context seems to make us happier, make us more the sorts of creatures that we're meant to be. Does that mean that we are only properly normative humans if we are in a proper relationship with mushrooms?
I think there are lots of people who are very healthy humans who have not had psychedelic experiences with mushrooms and may never do. So I would never be evangelical about it. But one of the things that these psilocybin experiences seem to do in the context of depression, one of the reasons why they seem to be helpful in depression, is that they can loosen the grip of our minds, the sort of tense minds and these calcified pathways of thought, where we can get trapped in repetitive loops and in ruts, and they can the elasticity and plasticity of the mind increases, and new cerebral possibilities arise, new thought horizons occur, and this can be really helpful for people in getting out of these stuck places. Not just people who are depressed. I mean, people take psychedelics for all sorts of reasons, and I mean, artists take psychedelics for inspiration. And it's a similar thing, to get out of a rut, to increase the possibilities of your mind, increase the possibilities of your senses and imagination. These are all ultimately similar reasons for taking these psychedelic experiences. But no, I wouldn't go so far as to say that we should all be taking mushrooms. Lots of people get this from other, I mean, people spontaneously have experiences of connection, of loosening, when they're playing music, when they're doing sport, when they're doing all sorts of things, eating a lovely meal, meditating, whatever. So this is just one way to accomplish this.
So there's a very long human history of getting fungi to do our digestion for us, and you can teach, your book tells me, fungi to do things like eat up cigarette butts. Are they the answer to all the world's waste?
Well, they've been dealing with the world's waste for a very long time, and it's called decomposition, and we take it for granted. But it's it really is an astonishing thing when you think about it for more than about 20 seconds. You realize how much we depend on it, how much we build it into our systems. I mean, just having a compost bucket and taking it to the end of the garden, put in the compost heap, we're taking advantage of the powerful decomposing abilities of these organisms. So yeah, in general, in the general condition of the world and life, fungi have been a great answer to the question of waste, because they make waste, they decompose waste so it can be recomposed into new forms of life. And so the question that we face at this point, with all sorts of new types of pollutant and new scale of degradation, is, can we work together with fungi to help mitigate some of these terrible problems? And I think it's very promising. I mean, fungi have amazing appetites for all sorts of things that we don't want to have in the environment. So one approach to this microremediation, as it's known, is to let fungi loose into some kind of situation, into a polluted environment, and hope that they either degrade the pollutant or concentrate it in the form of heavy metals. And then you pull out the fungus and take it somewhere else to burn it, or to make a heavy metal rich ash, which you then have to dispose of some other way. But I think the bigger possibility, perhaps a more advanced level of play, would be to try and reimagine our philosophies of waste, so that we can now, rather than putting the waste into the environment and then treating this symptom of our dysfunction, attitude to waste, to reimagine the waste circuits so that the waste goes through a sort of waiting fungal appetite in some processing plant before it hits the environment, to either turn it into something that can be used for whatever purpose, a useful product, or a less damaging form of waste, which could be become some feedstock for some new generative process. And that's being researched and investigated. The problem is that this is all terribly underfunded and underinvested in. Remediation is a very polluted. I mean, the conventional approach to remediation is to to go along with diggers and scrape up soil by the ton, and then take it off in trucks somewhere else and burn it. So we've got quite a long way to go. And it really it requires an ecological mindset. It requires a more long-term mindset. These are all things that anyone in the world of sustainable agriculture will be very familiar with. But I think that's the kind of attitude that we need to be applying.
Merlin, at this conference last year, George Monbiot created a storm by suggesting that we wouldn't have to farm any animals for meat because we could grow meat in huge vats, fungally or bacterially. Can fungi feed the world and make livestock farming redundant?
I'm not sure about making livestock farming redundant, because I see other values for livestock in sustainable agricultural processes than just to produce meat. But certainly fungi are part of the solution. I mean, you can grow fungi on waste products all through the year in small enclosed spaces. They grow quickly, they produce a high value crop. These edible mushrooms, not like the normal like button mushrooms, Agaricus bisporus, but say things like shiitake, lion's mane, these are all enormously healthy, are good for us to eat. So just mushrooms as a cash crop, I think, can be developed in all sorts of ways. Of course, we've been eating mushrooms for a very long time, for longer than we've been humans. But there are other ways as well. So corn, or as mycoprotein, is one well-established way. But there are all sorts of new mycelial meat alternatives being developed right now, which show great promise. High protein, low cholesterol, grown very easily in tanks or in vats, and people are getting much better with the flavors and the textures. There's a lot of exploration going into this right now. So I think that there's a huge amount of potential. I wouldn't go so far as to say replacing animals, but I think we can do a lot with fungi.
When you put a plough into the ground, do you smash up fungal networks, which you should really leave alone? Should we be all going for no-till?
There's no clear answer here, of course, because when we intervene in any ecological system, everything has causes and effects that ripple out in different ways. So by not ploughing, by going no-till, what other pressures are you putting yourself under? Do you then have to use herbicides? If you're using herbicides, how much? If you're using herbicides, what kind? And what are those ecological implications of your herbicide application? If you're not using herbicides and you're bringing animals in to trample the crop, or you're planting up you're planting up two crops at once, are those efficient ways for you to do the farming in the place that you're doing the farming? So big, complex issue. No straightforward answer, and I think it would always depend on where you were and the system that you were inheriting from whoever was farming it before you. But certainly, ploughing causes disruption to fungal networks and to the soil microbial communities in general. In some situations, you might be better off to plough and then to use crop rotation, or to take seriously the soil repair, to mend the soil after ploughing for X number of years before recropping it. You might be better off doing that than going no-till, depending on where you were or the systems that you were choosing to use. A lot of people, of course, if you were a big arable farmer and you've lost all your hedges and you don't have any animals and you've lost all the sort of will and the motivation to have animals, it will be very hard for you to do no-till farming without herbicide, because no-till farming without herbicide often requires animals. So everyone's in a different position here, and I think a lot of people are going to have to there's going to be a more general skill sets are going to have to be acquired to work across these problems. But yeah, it's a big open question, and I'm intrigued to see how solutions to it develop over the years.
So you've said that mycology has only recently become recognized in the academy. It's been up until now a community of people who occupy little desks at the edge of the plant science department, but it's now coming of age, partly as a result of you. If you had £1 billion to spend on mycology, what would you spend it on?
Well, I'd spend $1 million. The first $1 million I'd spend would be on a Microremediation competition. It'll be a prize, the Microremediation prize. And the idea of this would be to encourage people to develop fungal strains that were really good at digesting really fearsome, terrifying cocktails of poisonous waste. I'm imagining the prize competition being like a cross between a Formula One race and a dog show. And people would come together with their fungal strains, and you have to race their fungal strains through, let's say, a tube containing different types of toxic waste. You can have different categories. You can have the heavy metals category. You can have the polyaromatic hydrocarbons category. And then you can have a best in show. This is the just all-rounder. And I think this would catalyze enormous innovation. You'd have all sorts of amazing fungal nerds coming out of the woodwork. And I think it would be a great opportunity for public engagement as well, because with the right media coverage, I think this would be a media, so many low-hanging fruit here, but people would become so enthralled at these superpowers that fungi have, and would start to think about their metabolisms. And of course, then you'd realize that actually we live our lives in a world supported by astonishing fungal metabolisms. We live our lives engulfed in these giant biogeochemical cycles, which take place on too large a time scale or too slower, too large a space scale or too slow a time scale for us to really notice. So I think this would be a really powerful agent for change. And so that's the first $1 million. And then, I mean, I could go on, but maybe we should move on to
just finally from me, because there's a vast number of questions lined up. I start off by saying this is a brilliant book, beautifully written, immaculately researched, and so on. But it may be that you've been, the modest chap you are, surprised by the vast success of the book. Why has it touched such a nerve? Why is it a mega bestseller across the world? What's going on?
Yeah, I've been wondering why this is.
This is not the kind of thing from you, of course.
But I think there are a few reasons why I think the time is people are interested in fungi at this moment. There's a general ecological turn as we become more aware of the mess that we've made and the way that things are interconnected, and you can't disturb this over here without expecting to receive consequences over here. And as this ecological turn has grown, fungi have become a kind of ecological postal kingdom, because they, as we said before, live their lives in this interconnected way. So I think one thing is that this general more ecological mindedness. There's also the general enthusiasm about microbes, not just fungi, bacteria. They're powerful. There's no findings of the microbiome research. I think it tunes into something of that. Also, there's network thinking, the rise of network thinking as we live our lives continues with the digital networks of the internet and the World Wide Web. And network models are used to make sense of so many phenomena across so many different areas of human study. And so I think the fungi as network organisms tune into that network zeitgeist a little bit. And then there's the rise and resurgence of psychedelics. Much of there's research on psychedelics in recent years has largely happened with Psilocybin, which has increased, generated a kind of curiosity about what kind of organism could make this chemical and why. So I think that's a reason too. And then I think all this myco-evangelism of people like Paul Stamets, and who's been an amazing mouthpiece for the fungal kingdom for a number of years now, and has done a lot to nudge them into the popular consciousness. And so they've even featured in Star Trek. That's a big deal, that you'd have a whole Star Trek series based on intergalactic mycelial network, which you can tune into and travel from different dimension to different dimension. So a few reasons. So I think it's arrived at this interesting moment. And of course, a pandemic, as people have started to realize that the different ways in which we're connected and maybe not as in control as we think. And who are these other organisms that we've neglected? Neglected to think about, neglected to care about, neglected to learn about. So a few things, I think.
Thank you so much. I've got a 1,000 more questions of my own, but I can't hog it, and we need to move on to the questions which have been posed by people in the audience. Sarah asks, why so many medicinal compounds in fungi?
No one knows, but there are a number of possibilities. So there are lots of medicinal compounds in plants as well, of course. And And fungi, like plants, have very active secondary metabolisms. And secondary metabolism is the name given to parts of metabolism which are not to do with the basic housekeeping, day-to-day essential jobs. There's a kind of metabolic creativity, you can almost think of it as, where these all sorts of metabolic products accumulate in biochemical backwaters. Some of them may do something, some of them may do nothing, until one day they collide with an animal or another organism which they happen to affect. And at that point, they start to become an evolutionary adaptation, and they will be then subject to natural selection. But a lot of these compounds just are there because these organisms are, for example, most of the medicinal mushrooms, there's more medicinal mushrooms that are wood decomposing mushrooms than, for example, mycorrhizal mushrooms. Why this is isn't entirely clear, but it might be something to do with when they're digesting the metabolic apparatus which they need to digest wood, which is a very complex material, and the byproducts that they end up creating in the digestion of wood could provide precursors to maybe a greater variety of compounds than you would do if you were receiving all your energy from plants. But it's a good question without a good answer. I'm sorry.
It was a very good answer. Haley asks, how do you see fungi being incorporated into regenerative agriculture?
Of course, fungi have always featured in agriculture, even long before we were aware of them. I love this thought that since we have been engaging with plants, we've been engaging with fungi without necessarily knowing that we have. We might have had intuitions. So fungi have always featured in our efforts to feed ourselves and will continue to do so. And in sustainable agriculture, I think there are lots of ways. I think one of the first thing, of course, is to stop killing fungi, stop spraying fungicides, and stop spraying on huge amounts of inorganic fertilizers which damage the mycorrhizal relationships, stop breeding crop varieties with no thought to their ability to form healthy mycorrhizal relationships. We have these varieties of wheat which we bred completely blind to their symbiotic capabilities, and so we have these some sort of, I think of them as spoiled plants, these symbiotically dysfunctional plant strains. So there's that approach, which is stop doing the things that we know are harmful to the fungi and their fungal relationships. And then you can do the other approach, which is do all the things which are positively benefit fungi and fungal relationships, and which can be things like using organic fertilizers, compost teas, minimize soil disturbance. There are lots of things that can be done. And then there are other interesting takes. So there's a great study that came out recently where there's a fungus called sclerotinia, which is, I think it's called watery soft rot. It forms a horrible disease on plants. And it was found that when you expose this fungus to a virus, the fungus stopped being this awful pathogen, and it became, it didn't just stop being a pathogen, it became a very valuable endophytic companion to these plants. And so there are all sorts of things I think that we're just beginning to work out, that if you can say expose some of these fungi which are you think of as something to kill, if you instead convert them just by exposing them to a virus into a valuable endophyte, what kind of benefit can you bring? So there's lots of things that we're just beginning to know that we can do. And I think there's a lot to be discovered here, a lot to be explored. So it's a huge question. I think a really fascinating question, and one that we should get a lot more time than it does.
Thank you. Dot asks about what indigenous wisdom about fungi can tell us about fungi's role in agriculture, and particularly in the UK, is there indigenous wisdom in relation to fungi in agriculture that you know about?
Yes. So actually, I just had a wonderful story today. Robert McFarlane sent me an email. His father had been talking to a farmer near where he lives in, I think, Cheshire. And the farmer was saying that he's a cow farmer. And he's talking about how his father, when he was growing up there, then when cows were sick, they'd go down to a certain part of one of the fields where there was a hazel, sort of damp, marshy part of the field, and the sick cows would go and lick the ground around this particular tree, and they would usually get better. And his father, there was a field near there which was sort of swampy and full of rushes and thistles, and not a great place to harvest hay. But the father would always insist that they do this, and they harvested this hay and would go to a special place in the hayloft. And when cows were sick, when in the winter they were inside, then he'd say to his son, go and get a bundle of that stuff and give it to the cow, and the cow would pick through it and eat some stuff and leave some stuff, but usually would get better. So in this case, it seems like the cows were self-medicating possibly on some kind of mycelial fungus that was living around the roots of these trees or on these plants. And so in this case, I guess you could think about the indigenous wisdom twofold. You can think about the farmer's indigenous wisdom in supporting the cows in doing this, but also you can think about the wisdom of the cows in being able to self-medicate. So that's one good example from today.
Thank you. Helena asks, how do you measure the health of fungi in the soil in an agricultural context?
So you can, generally speaking, diversity is good as a rule of thumb. So if you take a soil sample and you do a DNA analysis, you sequence the DNA to get a census of who's there. And if you did that soil sample, if it was in an organically managed field with little soil disturbance and lots of organic fertilizers added, then you'd have a much higher diversity of fungi than if you did it in a industrially managed giant eroding field where no carbon had been added for years. Then you have very low diversity of fungi. So one axis is diversity. It's a very simple axis, and it doesn't tell you much about what the fungi are doing, but on the whole, diverse systems are better. But it depends on what kind of health you're looking for. It's the question splinters into specificities at that point. But on the whole, I mean, you can do it very simply. So I was talking to an amazing arboriculturalist recently, and he'd been working on Hampstead Heath, and he's talking about soil compaction as a big problem on Hampstead Heath. And he'd been making these areas with fences around them, around the root systems of old veteran trees. And he showed me this fence system around the tree, in just 3 years of no people trampling in this area. And the fruiting of mycorrhizal mushrooms around these trees had tripled or quadrupled in this time. And so for him, one measure of the health of fungi in this area was just how much fruiting were these fungi doing in this zone. How many mushrooms am I seeing, and how many different types of mushroom am I seeing? So you don't have to go high tech to answer this question.
Tilly asks, what are your thoughts about hydroponic, aquaponic, and aeroponic food production? Fungi being so caught up with the soil.
So mycorrhizal fungi still play important parts in hydroponic systems. I'm sure this could do with a lot more research, and I'm sure there's a lot of research that's just kicking off. But let's say you grew a hydroponic crop, you didn't add any mycorrhizal inoculum, and you germinated them in some sterile conditions. So you'd still have, almost certainly you'd have leaf endophytes and stem endophytes in that plant, whether or not, whatever the roots are doing. So it's very hard to have a fungus-free plant. Not that you want one. But I'm sure there are lots of ways that the mycorrhizal association would shift and adapt in response to these new root conditions, new root environments. And this might be a really interesting area. I mean, this has not happened a great deal in the natural history of plants. Normally roots are in soil of some sort. They can have human roots in water, I guess. If you have a willow tree by a river, you see its roots going out into the river. So hydroponic systems aren't all new, but I know there's some work going on among cannabis farmers in California using hydroponic systems and thinking about what are the mycorrhizal fungi doing in those situations. But I'm just sure that the fungi will continue to have an important role, and I would encourage anyone working with these systems to fold fungi into their plans rather than to think about them rather than not think about them.
Thank you. Jane has read that when you plant a tree, you should add some soil with its associated fungi from around established trees. She'd like to know if that's right, and if so, where should she get the soil from? And in particular, how deep should she dig?
This is a really important question. And so when planting trees, of course, there's relatively little thought is given to the soil they will be nurseryed in. At least in modern systems. I was talking to Ted Green recently, who's a very amazing tree man, and he was telling me that when he was growing up, the foresters where he was living, they would plant their Scots pines along the edge of a Scots pine forest, a forest of mature Scots pines, and then they would dig them out from there and take them to wherever they were going to plant the trees. A kind of living nursery. They did it not thinking too much about the fungi, but just because they'd always been told that works best. Ted Green himself has set up these living nurseries, organic nurseries. So in Windsor, he's got one. You have 4 oak trees at each corner of an area about the size of 2 tennis courts, and you grow your young trees in this zone so that they are inoculated with the soil fungi and also the soil bacteria from some relevant community. They're not. It's not just some random soil taken from some random place. It's irrelevant soil taken from a relevant place. And then those trees will do a lot better when they're planted out wherever they're going to be planted out. So a lot depends on where you're getting the soil from. Ted Green's approach, the living nursery approach, is better than taking a scoop of soil from here, because when you take a scoop of soil from here, you're going to you'll disrupt the network. Some mycorrhizal fungi don't sporulate very much. Some sporulate a lot. Some you'll kill when you disrupt the network. Some will survive just fine and will go on to inoculate the oak tree. So you'll get a more even representation of your wild mycoflora if you can use the living nursery approach rather than the soil approach. Although the soil approach is still a good approach if you can't do the living nursery approach. And so the question of where you get your living soil from, the answer would be from around the base of trees that were similar species, similar varieties to the one that you were going to grow. And so to have as close an ecological match as you possibly can.
We're running fast out of time. I'm told that we can go on until 5 past the hour, but there are still a number of questions. Anthony asks, your dream micro-remediation project?
Well, there are just so many. There's just the sort of pipe dream ones are being able to find a fungal strain or develop a fungal strain that can digest, say, plastic, certain types of plastic, and then to be able to deploy it easily in a way that it would just go and just devour all of those microplastic particles in the environment. It's not really going to happen that way, though. And so I like the idea of these really elegant, place this fungal strain in this fungal facility in between the waste creator and the environment, so that the waste doesn't actually get to the environment. I have a friend who's running a company called Mycocycle, and they're working to turn asphalt roofing. To asphalt roofing makes up a huge proportion of landfill waste, and so they're trying to intercept the asphalt roofing, feed it to these fungi to make some usable material out of it, and so you create value from a waste stream rather than just detoxifying the waste stream, and that feels like the double benefit. So anything that can do that, maximize the benefit, then I would sign up for.
You've dealt with tillage, but how does synthetic nitrogen and glyphosate affect fungi in soil? Asks Stephen.
Glyphosate, I'm not sure, but I imagine that it's not going to be good because you'll be killing off lots of fungal hosts and reducing the plant diversity in an area, and you would usually expect that to have knock-on effects and reduce the fungal diversity in an area as well. That's besides any detrimental effects of the glyphosate itself on the fungi. But the nitrogen, there are clear problems. And so nitrogen runoff from over-fertilization of fields creates a lot of nitrogen pollution, as many people know. But this is really bad for, say, trees, big old trees that have very mature communities of fungi. And these fungal communities have grown up and developed over time in a relatively, generally speaking, a relatively low fertility situation. And when the nitrogen comes along, it disrupts the balance of exchange between the plants and their fungal partners. Because if the plant can suddenly get nitrogen very easily from the soil, then these fungi who it has a trading relationship with, say trading carbon for nitrogen, then those relationships are disrupted. And these carefully, intricately managed relationships, which have taken many, many decades, potentially many centuries to arise, are disrupted. And so then these other benefits that the rich fungal community provides, apart from scavenging for nitrogen, those themselves are interrupted too. And there was this big study that came out in Nature a few years ago, which found that there's a worrying deterioration in the health of trees across Europe, probably due to synthetic nitrogen fertilizer runoff. So, yeah, it's a danger.
Jana asks whether you've come across fungi cultivated, presumably commercially, directly together with plants. Whenever you have plants, you always have fungi, but are there examples of them being put in beds side by side?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is trufficulture, the growing of truffles. Some species of truffles you can cultivate with some degree of success, like the tuber melanosporum, the Perigord black truffle. And because truffles are mycorrhizal, you can't plant a truffle without also planting a tree. So in truffle farming, there's this delicate situation when you have a truffle nursery where you have to inoculate seedlings with the truffle mycelium, and then grow them up together before transplanting them to your truffle orchard. So that's probably the situation in a way where there's most explicit attention given to the fungus. Whenever you plant out a plant, right, you're going to be planting out a fungi as well without thinking about it. But with the trufficulture, because the fungus is the main focus of attention, it's a slightly different. There's a different emphasis. But there are probably many other examples.
Holly asks, to reboot soils, she's interested in helping farmers to create suitable compost. Does the compost need to be broken up and aerated in an aerated static pile?
So I'm not an expert on compost production, but I was talking to a man who is the other day, and he was very proud about the fact that he's a no-dig composter, and he makes fantastic compost, but without having to do a lot of digging. And I think that the way he gets to that, and it is not, I don't want to be, this is not advice, because I'm not a pro here, but I think that the way he does this is by adding lots of carbon along with nitrogen. So if he's got composting toilets, he'd add lots of sawdust along with the human feces. There are other secrets to this worth looking at. His name's Nicky Scott, and he's really good on no-dig composting. But there are lots of methods to do this, and yeah, I am sorry that I'm not the person to ask in detail about this.
Got time for one very quick question. Have you any thoughts about how GM plants might affect the interconnectedness within the life of the soil? That's from Roz.
Well, it will depend on how they've been GM'd. There's all sorts of ways plants can be GM'd, and those will be for various specific traits. And there's a possibility of GMing plants so they'll be forming more productive relationships with the soil. Microorganisms potentially. You might have plants that have been GM'd to do something completely different, and some unfortunate byproduct means that they're not so good at forming relationships in the soil. Of course, we GM stuff all the time. When we selective breed, we're GMing, and as I said earlier, we've made these strains of wheat which were very, very bad at forming relationships with mycorrhizal fungi because we bred them to respond to high doses of inorganic fertilizer, and so we've essentially GM'd these plants using traditional GMing, to be bad at relating to their soil populations. So yeah, there's all sorts of ways to approach that question.
I feel a real party pooper. I'm sorry to be bringing the axe down on this. I would love to continue forever, and I know that there are lots and lots of other people who would too, but we've got to stop. Merlin, thank you so very, very much for a really fascinating hour. If you haven't bought his book, you really need to. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charles.